Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's online summit, Microsoft Teams, Security, Performance, and more. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors, Martello, Druva, BitTitan, AvePoint, RingCentral, and CoreView for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends, and I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our best to get to all of them. Our sponsors have provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. And last but not least, at the end of the second session, one lucky attendee will be receiving a Nintendo Switch. It's a home console, it's a handheld, it's the only game controller you'll ever need. But you must be present to win, so stick with us. And now let's get started with our first session, What's New in Microsoft Teams for Security, Performance, and Management. For this session, we've called on Ben Stejink, owner and chief cloud consultant at Intelligink. Ben is an information technology pro with extensive experience with Microsoft platforms and applications, including Microsoft 365, SharePoint, and Azure. During his busy career, he has consulted with a wide range of organizations from 5-person shops to global enterprises in fields ranging from government to professional sports. He's also a co-founder of the Jacksonville, Florida Cloud User Group, and he co-hosts the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast, a must listen if you haven't already. You are in for a great session. Take it away, Ben.
All right. Thanks a lot, John. Thanks for having me back again. Always glad to be here. I would say coming at you from warm, sunny Florida, but it's actually cold and rainy right here right now. 61 degrees, but you know what? We're having fun. We're working on Teams, looking at Teams today. So let's go ahead and dive into this topic about what's new in Microsoft Teams for security, for performance, for management. This was an interesting one to do, especially with the timing of today. Microsoft Ignite, Microsoft's big conference, was going on the last 3 days, Tuesday, I think it was Tuesday through Thursday. So there was a lot of news that came out over the last couple days. So I have spent the last few days absorbing a bunch of news, sorting through it, and getting some good content together for all of you today. So one of those things when we start talking about what's new in Microsoft Teams or in Microsoft 365 as a whole, frankly, it changes on a daily basis. I am always going back in or going into it, finding new stuff, seeing new stuff. So outside of this session today, what are some of the ways, I kind of wanted to start off with, what are some of the ways that all of you can keep up with some of this stuff? Obviously, I'm not here talking to you every day or every week to give you the updates. So I threw a couple resources together here. In particular, the Microsoft Teams blog. If you're looking at Microsoft Teams, lots of announcements coming out on there, especially this past week. There are a lot more details on that Microsoft Teams blog about features related to security, performance, management, as well as other announcements that Microsoft has made over the last week or so. The Microsoft 365 roadmap, this one is actually one of the biggest ones for me. There's a URL here. There's an RSS feed. I subscribe to the roadmap in my RSS reader, so I can always see what's coming, what's changed. When I created these slides, there was 125 features in development just for Microsoft Teams. So this is not even Microsoft 365 as a whole. I filtered it out to Teams. 139 features in Microsoft Teams. Or 125 when I made them. It was 139 after Ignite that got added. that are in development. There's currently 95 features for Teams that are in the process of rolling out. The Microsoft 365 environment, it's a large platform. It takes time for features to get to every single person that is using Microsoft Teams. So a lot of these features are in the process of rolling out. They have a 2-week, 3-week, 1-month time frame where they're gradually going from tenant to tenant, from server to server on the back end, so that you can get the features. So the roadmap is a great way to see what's coming, what's currently getting rolled out, what's already been rolled out. Keep an eye on that. Twitter, Microsoft Teams, and then again, conferences, blogs, Twitter, podcasts. Lots of information, especially over the last 2 years where maybe those conferences aren't as prevalent. There are a lot more virtual ones like this one. All great ways to keep up. So aside from this, I just wanted to give all of you those tidbits. That's what I use when I am looking to do sessions like this, when I'm looking just to personally keep up on Microsoft Teams. So let's dive into some of these. What were some of the things that came out over the last week or so from this perspective that I really found interesting, that I think can really help out all of you? One of the big ones, this is, some people may consider this one a smaller one. I think this is something that's been missing from Microsoft 365 and Teams administration ever since they rolled it out. And this is better management, or you're allowed to better manage team sites in your SharePoint admin environment. Some people may say, well, what do you mean team sites and SharePoint admin? I still get this question all the time of, my files are in Teams. I don't use SharePoint, I use Teams, I have Teams files. Teams files are in SharePoint. There's a SharePoint site behind every team. There's a SharePoint site behind every private channel that you create within a team. However, there was not great management of those team sites in the SharePoint admin side. You couldn't always see, especially those private channels. When you were trying to manage those SharePoint sites, keep an eye on your storage in SharePoint. So this one came out this week. It's starting now. I have this in my tenant already. So in a minute here, I'm going to show you what it looks like. This is one I love. It allows you to see how many sites are associated with a particular team. You can go in and see what they are, what their URL is, see various details about these SharePoint sites. So it's really bringing that management of those SharePoint sites used for files and teams to the forefront so you can see it. Another one is the Cloud Shell in the admin centers. This one is coming to the Teams Admin Center, should be there any day. This is one of those time frames you can see. Microsoft has said this will be in the Teams Admin Center anytime between mid-October, end of October. We're in November. This hasn't shown up in my Teams Admin Center yet. It may have gotten delayed a little bit in the process. It is showing up in my Microsoft 365 Admin Center. If you manage Teams, Microsoft 365, you need PowerShell. Great tool with Cloud Shell. This is something that started in Azure. It started in the Azure Admin Center and has made its way into Microsoft 365. You get a browser-based shell experience for writing Bash scripts using the CLI, writing PowerShell scripts. You're already authenticated. It's configured. Modules are installed. It's secure. So this is one of those that I love this. I'm also on a Mac. Apple's, yes, you can run PowerShell on a Mac. Not all the modules always work. Sometimes I need something that runs better on Windows. Instead of firing up a Windows VM, remoting into a server, I can start using this Cloud Shell now. So I'm going to try to mix this up, show you some demos where I can. I did have to sort through what I could show, what I couldn't show, just from what I had available to me. So let's go ahead and share my screen here and take a look at some of these. So first, let's jump up to the SharePoint Admin Center. Here's some of my active sites, and you'll see over here towards the right, I now have channel sites that shows up as a column within my SharePoint Admin Center. If you don't see this, mine was not there by default. If you click on your all columns in your SharePoint Admin Center and go over to, sorry, not there. That's where you save it. If you scroll all the way over to the right, let's try this again, and click on Customize Columns, you'll find that you should have a channel sites there. You may also have another one that wasn't showing for me was this Teams column. So you can add those to your view and rearrange them, put them where you want to. Once you added that, you'll see now I have, this is that default team site. So think of this, when I create a team, I get a SharePoint site. This is the one used for the general channel. So you can have that site there, but now I have this additional option. I have one channel site associated with this team. You can see the little team icon here. I have two channel sites associated with this one. If I click into two channel sites, now it actually shows me all of those same details about those SharePoint sites. Here's my private data, my private channel, created a couple of them here, the URL to what those SharePoint sites are for my private teams. I can go see who created them, the admins, the storage used. So I finally get that full management experience right within my SharePoint site for those team sites or for those private channel sites within SharePoint Admin. So again, it seems small. This is one that, especially with my SharePoint background, I absolutely love that Microsoft finally came out with this. Cloud Shell. I'm going to show you this in my main admin center, primarily because I don't have it in Teams yet. But up here in my Microsoft 365 Admin Center, you'll start having this little icon up here that looks like a PowerShell window. Again, this should come to the exact same spot in your Teams Admin Center any day. If you click on Cloud Shell, right within your browser window, it actually opens up a PowerShell window. And naturally, when I want it to open up right away, it's going to be finicky and not show anything. There it goes. So goes in, requests a Cloud Shell. You can see I have PowerShell here. I can also switch over to Bash. Azure CLI is here. All my Teams modules are here. I load it, comes right into PowerShell. I have a few options up here in terms of editing files, uploading files, doing some searching. But all I have to do if I want to go start writing PowerShell is I can connect to Microsoft Teams. It has some of the tab complete right in there. Hit enter, go out, connect to my Microsoft Teams environment right within my browser PowerShell window. Because I'm already in my admin center, it's not going to ask for a password. It's not going to prompt me to log in. I'm already in there authenticated. So I could do something like get Teams now, and it would go through, get all of my Teams. I could go start writing all of those different scripts that I may want to run against my Teams environment right within this PowerShell window, right in the browser. So again, once it comes to Teams, you'll be able to do this from Teams. It's going to be the same type of feel, the same type of look when it comes to managing or using that browser shell window. So just a couple things there. Show off those because those were a couple that came to my environment that I could use. And again, as we go through as well, feel free to post questions. I may try to get to some of them as we go. I'll definitely leave some room at the end and try to get through as many as I can. Some other things, information governance. This was another interesting one that they've been doing a lot of work around lately. And there were some in particular when it came to information governance that related to Teams. One of these is now you can actually do retention of messages within a private channel. So I'm in Teams, I'm having a conversation. For compliance reasons, regulatory reasons, legal reasons, I need to retain all of that communication for a certain period of time. I can now go into my Compliance Center in Microsoft 365, configure retention labels for these private channel messages, to make sure that messages don't get deleted from within those private channels for that specified time period. Again, a super handy feature if you fall into one of those areas where you want to make sure these get retained. Target retention to specific teams. This is another interesting one. So previously, when you would go in and apply retention policies, they would really apply to the entire environment, or you would have to go in and actually select this team is included, this team is excluded, this one's included, this one's included. A new team gets created. If it had to get added and you had those selections in there, you had to go in and tweak your selections to make sure any new teams got included. There was a fair amount of manual work when it came to targeting retention policies, especially if you didn't want these to be applied to all of your teams. Recently, Microsoft has added adaptive scopes to retention policies that allow you to target specific Office 365 groups and thus teams with retention policies. So now instead of doing a manual selection, you go in and set up a rule. I want to scope these retention policies to every team that has a particular owner or that has a particular word in the name of the team. So there's certain rules that you can go in and set when you create these adaptive scopes in order to be able to automatically target specific teams based on that set criteria of which ones are going to get some of these retention policies. Another one around retention when it came to information governance. And this was also an interesting one that frankly hadn't occurred to me up until I saw this announcement. I was like, that makes a lot of sense. This is one that allows you to retain a specific version of a file that was sent. So whether this was shared with a Teams message or shared via Exchange using like a sharing link, this is a retention policy that says retain the specific version that was sent at that specific time. Users can go in and make edits to the file after the fact. They can make changes to the file. They can still interact with that file as normal. However, when it comes to e-discovery, compliance, those types of things, you're going to know exactly which version of that file was shared with somebody. So if there's ever a legal dispute, something that comes into play for a particular file that was shared with Teams messages or Exchange, you're going to be able to pull that very specific version, not just, here's the file. I don't know exactly which one of those 500 versions it was at when it was shared, but here's the file. Now you can pull out that version. This one does require auto-labeling, which is a E5 feature, so it may require some additional licensing based on what you have or don't have already. But this one is going to be coming soon. It should start showing up environments. I haven't seen this particular one pop up in mine yet, but it is coming. And then another one with auto-labeling is actually applying a retention policy based on a sensitivity label. So certain information, again, it's going to be auto-labeling, but financial information is detected. Bank account numbers, maybe it's HIPAA content, social security number, driver's license number, and you need to make sure that's retained for a certain amount of time. I think particularly in the financial industry, at least here in the U.S., a lot of financial documents for tax reasons, I believe, have to be retained for 7 years. I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. This is my understanding of it. But now if financial information is detected in a document, put a retention policy on it for 7 years so you know none of your financial documents are going to be deleted for 7 years, or once they hit 7 years, they automatically get deleted. So another new feature that was announced around those retention policies. Because this wasn't in my environment yet, this is where you're going to be able to go in and actually apply those labels to those cloud attachments. So just a quick screenshot here. I was able to pull it out of some of the Ignite content of it adds that additional option. So if you're thinking, I want to save those specific versions when they're shared, this is the option you're going to be looking for, is adding a label to a cloud attachment shared via Exchange or Teams. And again, you can see that is one of those auto-labeling policies. So there were a few of these I could share, and I actually want to look at the question, is the retention that granular to filter correctly without thinking to put others in that group for the retention? Yeah, that is it. So there was a question that I saw, and I wanted to get to this because I'm going to show this demo here as well, of retention granular to filter correctly without thinking. Depending on how you label things, yes, you could filter correctly and set it up properly. There may be some other governance things that come into play in terms of how you name your sites and things like that. But that granular filtering is kind of the goal of some of those adaptive scopes. So, and just kind of showing off some of those retention policy options, you will see adaptive scopes up here is one of those features that's still in preview. And this is what allows you to kind of do that dynamic labeling. So if I click up here, look at my adaptive scopes, I created a demo one already, but this is going in and creating a new scope. We'll just call this Demo 2 Scope. Go ahead and click Next. And this is where you start getting those options. So we're dealing specifically with Teams today. So maybe this is your Microsoft 365 groups. But you can use these adaptive scopes, as you can see, for other things, SharePoint sites, users. So we're going to stick with our group setting for this one. And then this is where you have to go build out your query. So in terms of the granular filters, it very much depends on, of these attributes on your Microsoft 365 group, which, again, from terminology standpoint, is what drives teams. When you create a team, you get a Microsoft 365 group. Names are tied together, all of those. So you can do it off names, display names, some of those descriptions, aliases, email addresses, and then you do have all of your custom AD attributes that you can use as well. So if you're going in, maybe you're manually defining attributes based on some type of categorization, it would be nice to see some additional attributes come in here as well, something like sensitivity labels or other types of attributes that you could filter on a little bit better. But realistically, it's going to be name. This is the other one I was a little disappointed with, frankly. I wanted a contains. I don't want an is equal or is not equal to or a starts with. I would love to see contains so I could put something in the middle or at the end. Starts with, you can get away with it. Again, if you get in the habit with your teams of prefixing your teams, maybe like every HR team is HR, or you do IT. Or if you have confidential teams, it's a confidential team. It starts with confidential because all your teams are like confidential dash executives or something like that. So this is where you do have to get a little bit creative, make sure you have what you need. You can add additional attributes. You can do your ands, your ors. There is an advanced query builder where you could go enter OAuth paths. This is one I haven't had the time with all of the announcements to go in and dive into these advanced queries, but it is an option you could go play around with and look at what you can do from that perspective. So once you set these scopes, we can go ahead, create our Demo 2 scope. We'll finish that one up. Now when you go in and apply these retention policies, if we go in and create a new retention policy, and we'll just keep going with our whole Demo 2 theme here, you have that option to do an adaptive one or a static one. Static is going to give you a lot of those same options. You'll pick where you want it. You'll see you have like those private channel messages in here now. You have Yammer in here as well that just came out But if you choose adaptive, then it's not going to give you those options to choose those locations because it's tying 100% into those adaptive scopes. So now I go in, we created that Demo 2 scope, I add that. It's going to figure out this is tied to Microsoft 365 groups. So now I can go in and do my Teams channel messages or my Microsoft 365 groups based on what I want that scope to be, and then go in and set the rest of those retention options like you had before in terms of time frame, what it's going to be based on, if you're going to retain items forever. Once you get to here, it's all of those normal retention policy settings that you would have had in the past when you were going in and setting up various retention policies. So we can go ahead, we can cancel that. Again, your label policies, your labels, all of that type of stuff is the same. The biggest things that came out of this announcement were primarily around those adaptive scopes, and those may have even hit preview a little bit before Ignite, and then being able to go in and apply those various retention policies to those private channel messages. So another really cool feature, a lot of work being done just across Microsoft 365 as a whole when it comes to some of this data protection. Another fun feature, advanced audit in Microsoft 365. This is tied specifically to the unified audit log in Microsoft 365. Another one of those features, the feature in and of itself has been around for a long time. It's probably been around almost since Microsoft 365 became a product. But they're adding some additional capabilities to it. You're now able to audit some of these additional team events. In particular, message edits. So when does a user, if they're allowed to edit messages in your teams, when do they actually go in and edit them? Are they making changes to them? Are they updating the content of those messages? Message edits are one of those new events that is coming to that unified audit log. Deleted messages is another one. Now, a lot of companies allow their users, they're conversing in chat, they go in and delete a message. Again, this one could be a big deal for you. From a legal perspective, you look at social media, there's cyberbullying, there's inappropriate content. I mean, you look at the news and see different things that have come up of inappropriate behavior in the workplace. If that is happening via text in Teams, and then people are going in and editing it later or deleting these messages, there could be some liability issues there. There could be some compliance issues there. You think about even things like, insider trading, where people are exchanging information they shouldn't be in Microsoft Teams, and then they're going in and editing it or deleting it later. Those are now additional events that are going to get audited that you can go in and look at. It does appear that this is included in E5. It was a little vague reading through some of the documentation around this and looking at some of the sessions on how this fits in. You can go in right now and just sign up for a trial version of it if you don't have an E5. You'll see this is rolling out to customers who meet the criteria. This could be location-based, based on your country. It could be based on what tenant you're in, if you're in like the commercial one versus one of the government, nonprofit, education tenants. So there's certain criteria you do have to meet. Microsoft didn't necessarily define that. They just said, if you meet this criteria and you don't already have an E5, the trial is going to be rolling out to you. As a compliance solutions trial, I went in and looked at my E5. I found message updates. I did not find deleted messages in mine. So again, this is one of those, it's kind of rolling out, it's coming. If you use some other products as well, I know this is focused on Teams. This is another one of those that is going to include, or this announcement also included additional activities that are going to be audited in Yammer, in Stream, in Forms. Some of those other products, as Microsoft's continuing to evolve these products, there's different events that they want to get audited. It's not just Exchange, SharePoint, Azure AD anymore. So this is another nice one. I'm going to actually show a quick demo of this because I did find this in my environment as well. So what you'll see down here, and I actually pulled up I had it up, it got erased. You can go in and look at, let's do messages. So this is the Unified Audit Log. This is where you can actually see there's a lot of different things here. There's Exchange messages. My Teams activity is gone. Wonder if it was just message. There we go. Message has more Teams. So this is, you can actually go into and look at other things around messages that just weren't announced. In terms of reading messages, this was that updating messages. See, I could not find delete or removed a message in mine. But if I just go out and search for updated messages, this is going to go query my tenant over the last week or so. And it will tell me, once it loads here, what messages actually got edited, when they got edited, who edited them. One thing it does not show, now it's not going to work. It was working for me earlier today. We'll pretend that worked. And I will describe to you what you would have seen. Maybe I'll try one more search. It doesn't actually show the contents of the message in the audit log. So you're not going to be able to go and pull out what the actual text of the message was. It's searching everything. My audit log search is all kinds of broken right now. Update. Yeah, now it's going to pull a SharePoint Teams. We'll just keep going in the interest of time. So it gives you an ID for where the message was in terms of groups, in terms of the channel it may have occurred in, and it gives you the ID of the message. So there's other ways to go associate an ID with a message. Again, because this is rolling out, I don't know if message content is going to be included down the road, if you're going to have those options. But it does not necessarily anonymize it, but it doesn't necessarily make the contents of all these messages just visible in this audit log for people to go in and look at. So what else do we have? Device management. This was another big one, which this one's always a little interesting because there are a lot of people that are working from home, but on the same side of things, people are starting to go back to work. They're starting to go back to offices. There's also been a big push from Microsoft and from other hardware vendors that you see a lot of these team room devices, team devices, various types of hardware. And it could be something as basic as your computer or your mobile device, connecting to Teams for these meetings. A lot of this device management does gear a little bit more towards those team room devices that you can get towards some of those hardware devices. But there were a bunch of announcements out of Ignite around managing devices. The first one was this monitor and manage device health. This was already there. You could already do some device health management in terms of using some rules that Microsoft would leverage to go in and evaluate what is the health of this device, how well is this device working, is it connecting, network connectivity issues, device health. But there wasn't a way to actually manually update the severity of that device issue. One thing you can do now is to manually update those to have that device health be more reflective of your particular scenario and your needs. Maybe you have a location that you have certain known issues with. You're okay with that. This is flagging it as a high priority health issue. And you're like, no, I know about that issue. We're okay with it. It's not a high priority issue. You can go in and manually update the severity to minimize that in those reports and analytics that you may pull out. Another one is workplace management. This allows you to go in and define various locations. Maybe you're a larger company, you have several different offices, maybe you have several users that are in different locations, and you want to be able to look at device health, not on a device-by-device basis, but on a specific location. What is the device health in all of these different locations? This gives you a new view of your data, your analytics, to all of those devices in a specific physical location. And this could be all the meeting room devices in a particular meeting room, in a particular building. There's a few different ways you can go in and kind of slice and dice your devices based on those different locations to view that health. This is one. None of these device management ones I've really seen start surfacing in my tenant yet. I'm also an independent consultant. I don't have a lot of devices personally, so I don't have a bunch of different locations. Clients I've had, this isn't one that I've seen start popping up yet since Ignite. Another one is scoped team device admin. And this takes advantage of administrative units that rolled out several months ago within Azure AD, where you can define admin units that are responsible for administering a segment of your environment. This could be, when it rolled out, it was geared more towards like managing users in terms of password resets on users, updating user information. They're now using administrative units to roll out scopes of managing Teams devices. So again, you have multiple locations, you have particular people that are responsible for those devices in that particular location. They don't need to manage or worry about devices that are in locations that are across town or that are even hundreds of miles away or in a different country even. So you can now start scoping down which devices they can administer based on those administrative units in Azure Active Directory. Device analytics, there's going to be some dashboards that help pull some more of those device-related metrics in. This is nothing, I would say, mind-blowing. It's just providing a little bit more reporting. A nice pane of glass, nice report to pull out different metrics such as inventory distribution across different locations, utilization of devices, several different trends and analytics that you can start pulling out, drilling down on these devices, seeing, do you have devices that just aren't used? Do you have a specific conference room that you have a Teams room devices and it has zero utilization? Maybe that should be moved to a different location where you have 100% utilization and you're looking for more options. So a few different options there in terms of what's on that dashboard. And then some additional device management alerts. So checking on the status of these devices, triggering a webhook to automatically open a service ticket, different options there when it comes to helping to alert these people that are managing devices when there is an issue or something that occurs, something that happens that they need to go check on. So again, go look at a bunch of these updates. A lot of these are still in preview or are still coming, still rolling out. So you may not have all of these yet, but it gives you a good idea of things you may want to keep an eye out for, things that may be helpful within your environment going forward over the next few months here. Information barriers. This is one that I have not had the need for as of yet. But companies that do need these information barriers, some of this is a big deal to them. There were some specific requests around information barriers that Microsoft has addressed with some of these announcements from Ignite. So information barriers, if you aren't familiar with them or haven't heard that term before, specifically when it comes to Microsoft 365, is you have particular divisions within your company, different departments, maybe even different business segments that all live within under a parent company's Microsoft 365 environment. And again, it goes back to usually a lot of legal reasons, compliance reasons. Information is not allowed to cross segments. Whether this is people not being allowed to talk to each other, people not being able to collaborate with each other, you need to put barriers between people to ensure, in order to meet compliance, that these users are unable to communicate. However, that being said, there may also be very specific scenarios where they should be able to cross those segments. And before, there was not the flexibility that was there, especially when it came to the SharePoint site that lived behind the team if they had to collaborate. So Microsoft introduced barrier modes at Ignite, and 4 different barrier modes that you can configure. So I defined them here. There's a lot of text on this slide. We'll kind of talk through them and help you out. Feel free to grab a screenshot of this if you do want to remember this. You can go find the documentation for this as well out of Microsoft, but open is based on the policy applied to another. So SharePoint doesn't have an idea of segments. When you think of segments, think of like a department, HR, a segment of users. It's going to be multiple users. So SharePoint doesn't have a segment defined to it. This is purely based on a policy applied to the users when it comes to information barriers. This one comes into play a lot, like if you think about a company picnic, a company event, where everybody should be able to talk. There's some collaboration there. Maybe you want to go see pictures from the event that are up in SharePoint. This gives you the most amount of flexibility in terms of being able to allow certain content in SharePoint to cross some of those barriers based solely on a policy that's applied to the individual users. The next one is owner moderated, where this does allow some of that collaboration between incompatible segments of users. This only applies to group disconnected sites in SharePoint. So you have to create a site, in this case, that's not associated with a Microsoft 365 group. Thus, it's not one that comes from Microsoft Teams. This one, it doesn't let you share with anybody. You can't do like the anonymous link sharing. You can't do the company-wide sharing. But you can only share based on the site owner's information barrier policy. So this doesn't necessarily apply based on the user-by-user policy, but on who is the site owner in SharePoint. Again, this one is much more SharePoint specific, not as much when it comes to Teams. Then you have an implicit mode where the SharePoint global admin can't necessarily manage the segments of that. Same type of thing as owner moderated. You can't share with anybody. You can't share with company-wide. You can only share if the site segment matches the user segment. So let's say you have a team. This team segment was HR. Only content in that team or that site associated with that team can be shared with users that also have HR as their segment. So you can't start crossing segments of users in this information barrier option. The way you can do this, new users can be added via Teams. They get added to the team. They can then go in and work with that content. And then explicit is going to be that most restrictive one. You can't share with anybody. You can't share company-wide. Same thing, you can only share if the site segment matches the user segment. And new users can only be added if the site segment matches the user segment. So you lose that whole add the new users via the Teams end member. You have to match those segments if they're going to be able to see it. You also get some barrier insight cards in your SharePoint Admin Center. So some nice insights there. Again, this one probably doesn't apply to everybody, but if you're in one of those cases where you do have information barriers, this is going to be very helpful to you in terms of allowing your users to collaborate. And then I do have just a few other random ones that popped up. Co-authoring on Microsoft Information Protected documents. So if you have Word, Excel, PowerPoint documents, you're working on them in Teams, they're stored in SharePoint, you want to do co-authoring, if they had that information protection on them, encrypted documents, you couldn't do co-authoring on them. That was announced this last week at Ignite, so you can do co-authoring on them now. Auto-labeling. Again, auto-labeling was an E5 feature, but previously auto-limiting was limited at up to 10 sites. You could go in, you could select 10 sites. If you tried to apply auto-labeling to 15, 20, 25, you would get an error that it was only up to 10 sites. It was announced that now you can do it across all of your sites. So auto-labeling will now work across all of SharePoint, all of OneDrive, if you are in that scenario where you want to use auto-labeling. Microsoft Teams, end-to-end encryption option for Teams one-to-one VoIP calls. This one is not enabled by default. You can go in and enable this right away if you want to. This was already announced, already released. It is can only enable it with PowerShell. If you go look at the new CS Teams Enhanced Encryption Policy Commandlet in PowerShell, and you could go use the Cloud Shell that we looked at earlier for doing this, you can go ahead and enable that end-to-end encryption. They are bringing this to the Teams Admin Center. Down the road, you'll be able to go into the Teams Admin Center, enable this encryption, turn it all on there. Most of these features, especially when they're kind of preview, they're brand new, they come to PowerShell first. PowerShell is usually the first way you can go and enable and configure a lot of this stuff, and then they roll it out to the Teams Admin Center down the road. Another nice one is the Teams Search in the Admin Center. This is one that is also coming soon. I have not seen this pop up yet in my Teams admin environment, but this is just enabling you to leverage search to find more than just like do a user search, but it'll help you to be able to search for different settings, different configuration options down the left navigation bar there. It will still allow you to search for users, allow you to search for groups and teams. So just kind of a global search the admin center for whatever you're looking for type feature. And this is one I believe I saw it's rolling out now or rolling out soon. Kind of just keep an eye on your Teams Admin Center, and hopefully you will see this one show up in the relatively near future, especially if you're like me, can never remember where the different settings are in the Teams Admin Center or where they move to. I love search. I love search on my OS. I love search on Microsoft 365. I find search a much easier way to find stuff. So the more places I can get search, the happier I am. So that was a brief overview of kind of what's new, what's coming. Again, I tried to focus on performance, management, security type features coming to Teams, not necessarily everything. If you did watch Ignite, pay attention to it. You may have seen a lot more there. So I know we have a few questions here, and if anybody has any additional questions, now is the time to get them in.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. That's
not a problem.
That's a reminder to everyone that if you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to get to all of them. So shall we get going on the questions?
Yeah, let's get going on some of these questions.
All righty, let's do this one here. What about the moving whole channels from team to team function? Any idea on a timeline for this, or are we stuck using a third-party app to manage?
I have not seen a timeline yet for moving the whole channel from team to team. I get that a lot of people really want that one. I would agree that I think that would be super beneficial to have. I will say with how they're structured, I think there's probably a lot of complexities there. Just from looking at some of the other features. So one feature that just came out for private channels is that when you rename the private channel, it just now is starting to actually rename like the folder in the bucket that content is stored in. So to me, that seems super basic. Like if I rename a private channel, why would not all the underlying stuff change as well? Now you kind of extrapolate that out to moving a whole channel from team to team. I think there's a lot of under the covers stuff there when you're trying to move it that comes into play. And using third-party apps they probably don't do everything that Microsoft wants to do if they're going to kind of move it behind the scenes for you. So that may have been a really long answer, but I don't see a timeline on it, and I think it's probably more complex than what even I probably realized, just with all the stuff that's sitting there behind the scenes.
Gotcha. Thank you. So here's another one. Have there been updates about an improved Teams client and using less CPU?
Maybe if you use Windows 11, although I cannot verify that one. I've heard mumblings. I've heard rumors. It is a very, very well-known issue that I've seen people say Microsoft Teams makes my computer sound like it's going to take off. Microsoft Teams client, it happened. Truth be told, it happened on my Mac. It happens on my Mac. It happens on Windows. Teams just seems resource intensive. I was hoping for some announcements at Ignite about some updates from the performance perspective, and that was one of those, putting these together. It said, what's new in Teams for security, performance, and management? And it didn't see a whole lot for performance, especially around the Teams client. I was hoping maybe we'd see something about that. I have heard that with the work, again, I haven't been able to fully verify this. I have heard that the Teams client on Windows 11 does maybe work a little bit better. Keep our fingers crossed. Maybe we'll see something coming in the next year or so.
Okay, thanks. Here's one. Not related to security, performance, and management, but what are your thoughts on mesh in Teams?
Do you like your legs, John? Did you watch these demos of mesh? Did you see those?
I did.
You know what? The jury's still out. I want to experience it. I think it was Spring Ignite where they talked about doing it with the HoloLens. And you're like in this virtual environment. If anybody's ever read or listened to the audiobook like Ready Player One, it kind of reminded me of the whole Oasis thing where you're like going into a virtual environment and have virtual meetings and all of that. They announced that it's all coming to Teams now. So you can be like an avatar on your Teams calls. The reason that I don't know, I want to play with this. One, I feel like looking at an avatar maybe is a little bit better than people that don't want to turn on their cameras, even with the blurred background. They just don't like being on camera. So I'm looking at like a dot with their initials in the bubble. Maybe the avatars coming do give a little bit more personality to it. Personally, I still prefer a camera. I'd much rather actually like see a real person. It feels a little gimmicky to me. Kind of like, yeah, I'll try it once or twice, but then are people really going to turn on their avatars? What's it going to do to CPU performance when you're trying to look at a person? Because it's going to look at you and use your camera to like replicate your hand movements, your facial expressions. To me, that also sounds a little bit compute intensive. So I don't really know. And then they did show like the whole virtual environment. You go stand at a virtual whiteboard, you interact in a virtual space, but it literally was like floating torsos. It was from the waist up of everybody. I saw one comment from somebody on Twitter that was like, hey, look, mesh is just like what everybody's been doing for the last 2 years, just dressing from the waist up for all these meetings. And mesh like just replicated that.
That's great.
Yeah, I don't know. I want to play with it. I have mixed feelings on Mesh and on how useful it's going to be. I think some of it depends on, maybe some of it will even depend on how much people go back to work out of all of this. I don't know. It'll be interesting. Jury's out.
Well, time will tell. Okay, Ben, that's all the time questions we have time for right now. Thanks for a great session.
All right, not a problem. Thank you, John. Thanks for having me again. I hope everybody enjoys the next couple sessions as well. And enjoy your day. Enjoy your weekend.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and, of course, Martello, Druva, BitTitan, AvePoint, RingCentral, and CoreView for underwriting the summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization and Cloud Review, here to moderate the second session of our summit called Top 10 Microsoft Teams Best Practices Every Organization Needs to Implement. I'd like to introduce our speaker for the session, Nathan O'Brien. From Portland, Oregon, Nathan is a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master, Messaging, and a 5-time former Microsoft MVP for Office servers and services. He specializes in Exchange, Office 365, Active Directory, Azure, and a bit of Teams. Nathan works as an independent consultant and actively contributes to the Exchange and Office 365 communities by writing articles for several tech websites and his own blog. Nathan, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Thank you very much, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Glad you could join me here today. We're going to talk about some Teams best practices. So I kind of arranged this as if I were, doing a Teams deployment for a customer. This is kind of the first list of things that I would go over with that customer, and in order to prepare them for a Teams deployment and get their organizations ready and everything set up. Of course, if at any time during the next hour you have any questions for me, please feel free to put them in the little Q&A box there at the bottom of the screen. I will leave some time at the end to try and get to those. Of course, we'll probably stop a few minutes before the top of the hour, give you a few minutes to go ahead and take a quick break before we move on to the next session there. I know there's another session coming after me. So with that, let's get started. This is a list of the best practices I'm going to talk about with you today here. We're going to talk about training, compliance, headsets, authentication, clients, your network, team and channel creation. We're going to talk about team moderation, naming convention, who owns the data in Teams, and then controlling some of those extra features, memes, GIFs, emoji, that sort of stuff in your Teams. So that's kind of the 10 topics we're going to talk a little bit about over the next hour here. Of course, again, questions, please put them in there. We'll address them at the end. With that, let's get started. Let's get into this. We have limited time here, so I'll kind of go quickly. First of all, best practice I wanted to talk about is training. And I've divided this one into two different categories of training. I think that's important. When you're doing a Teams deployment, you need to understand your two main groups of people who are going to need training on Teams. And the first one is your admins, your IT department, the people that are going to be supporting your Teams deployment. It's very important to, first of all, understand that Teams is unlike any application that your users have ever used. Teams, of course, is a cloud-only application. There's no Teams server that you can deploy on premises. It's only available within Office 365. Hopefully we're all aware of that. But also Teams stretches across other Office 365 applications, SharePoint, Skype for Business, Exchange Online, those other applications as well, and has ties into those. So it's important to understand that Teams is very broad and it's a very different application than your team is used to, and it may take a little bit of extra ramp-up time for your administrators to have a good understanding of Teams, what it is, and be able to support it within your organization. It's super important that your administrators understand Teams, have some ramp up time, have some training, and get to play with it a bit before you start deploying it out to your users. Again, this probably should be self-evident, but in my experience doing these deployments like this, far too often do organizations just, Teams is in Office 365, I don't really have to set it up, so let's just start getting the users in there and then we'll figure it out as we go along. I find that's an easy way to cause yourself all kinds of problems. So it's best if we, as the administrators, take that time to ramp up and know about Teams before we start deploying it to the users, and we're able to address their questions. And then when you're training your admins, I think it's important to do really thorough, complete training across Teams. Even if there's features that you don't initially intend to roll out or make available to your end users, I think it's well worth the time for your administrators to have a complete understanding of Teams, how it works, all the things that it does, even features that you don't intend for your users to have access to or to use at all, because they are going to get questions about these other features. Hey, why aren't we using this feature or that feature? Can we use this feature? Why are our team set up this way or that way? What else can I do with Teams? That sort of stuff. And even if those features, you're not making them available to your end users, I think it's important for IT departments to be able to address those questions and make sure that our users have the understanding of the application that, to answer the questions they need. Don't forget about Azure Active Directory, Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, probably even some Skype for Business training in there. Again, as I've said, Teams is a application that stretches across all these technologies and more within your Office 365 tenant. So, you really want to make sure, again, that your administrators are over-prepared with a full understanding of Teams and Office 365 in general before you start pushing it out to the users so that they can address those questions. It really helps with user confidence in the product. If they're calling the help desk and the help desk answer is, I don't know about that feature, never heard of that, that can really undermine user confidence and kind of hurt your entire Teams deployment and the success your organization has with that. PowerShell is awesome. I know we talked about it a little bit in the last session. PowerShell is really the way that Microsoft is going with all the control features for Office 365 and really all their products. So it's a good idea to have a good understanding of PowerShell as new features come into Teams. The control and management for those features will often, pretty much always, or most always, will show up in PowerShell first. So you want your administrators to be able to use PowerShell, be able to connect to PowerShell, to know how to figure out PowerShell commandlets, how they work. Good familiarity with PowerShell is really important for your administrators before you start rolling out Teams. And then kind of the last thing that I wanted to talk about in this admin training session is that training for cloud applications is never done. I'm often surprised about customers, people that I work with, their kind of reaction when I say that. This Office 365 is not static. It's whatever it is now, it's going to be something different next week, next month, and next year. So really, you have to keep up with that training. It has to be a constant effort on your organization, your IT department's part to keep abreast of what's going on in Teams, to understand the new features and the new changes. This is something that it just has to be part of our day-to-day routine as IT professionals to keep training for these services, understanding that, we're not going to see a new version in 3 years. We could see significant product changes next week. So, keep up with that training. All right. Next topic is training for the users. Unlike training for the admins, training for the users needs to be much more targeted. At this point, when you're starting to prepare for a Teams rollout, before you're getting Teams to your users, you need to train the users on the features and functionality of Teams that they will be using, how you want to use Teams. But you probably, you're not going to be super successful if you try and, have the entirety of your organization taking a complete Teams training course. Probably users are way more interested in just the features that they're going to be using in the rollout. They're going to want to know, how do I set up a meeting? How do I create a channel? How do I save documents in here or share them? Or, how do I chat? How do I save chat history? That sort of thing. It's way more important for the user training to be targeted so that you don't lose the users, in overtraining and in giving them too much that they're not really going to be interested in. And as you turn on new features later, train your users for those new features before they become available to the users. That's important. Different people will prefer different forms of training, whether that be in-person training, kind of the in-person class, an online webcast, webinar, something like this, just written documentation. You really have to be familiar with your user base and understand what sorts of training are going to be most effective for your end users, how you can get users to take that training, and make different sorts of training available to different groups of users or even within the same group of users, because you'll have, your accounting department, there may be people who prefer just reading a manual or a written set of instructions on how to join a Teams meeting versus people that want to see, more of a instructional tutorial video or things like that. And the last thing I wanted to kind of touch on here is, I hear this a lot, is, we've always done X this way. And really, again, with Office 365 or really any cloud product, I think the point is these technologies are always evolving and they're always changing. And, Microsoft and other cloud services companies put a lot of effort into giving us the best experience that they can, which may mean that the entire application, the entire way of doing things changes. And you don't really want to be stuck in a mindset of doing the exact same thing the exact same way all the time. So really make sure that your users understand we're doing things differently now, and we may do things differently going forward in different situations. It's important to be flexible and to be prepared to change the way that we do things within reason, and that's comes down to an organizational culture. So you really want to prepare your users for that we're going to do things differently and be prepared to be flexible in that. All right, moving on to our second best practice. As we're getting ready to deploy Teams, compliance is always super important. There's a lot of potential data to be going into Teams, and organizations have different compliance requirements, and compliance requirements can be hard, they can be confusing, and they're not necessarily a really static set of do this and don't do that. The way I always explain it is compliance works a lot like your taxes. That is to say, if I were to take all my tax information for this year and put it in, make 10 copies of them and put them in 10 different boxes and send them to the 10 best CPAs in the world, I would probably get 10 different answers back as to how much I owe in taxes. And that's okay, because there isn't really, one specific answer that's right or wrong. It's really about, if the IRS asks me about my taxes, I can defend each of the choices that were made to go into the numbers that went under that. And compliance works a lot like that. It's really about having good documentation and being able to defend the choices that you make and the configurations that you make and the way that these specific products are used and the way that your data is handled. So having good documentation, super important. You want to think about things like logical firewalls. Are specific groups of users supposed to be separated from other groups of users? Who has access to what documents when they're put into a specific team or a channel or a SharePoint site? Do we need to keep that chat history? Do we need to delete that chat history? How long do we need to keep it? All that's really important when you set up your compliance and start thinking about how compliance works within Teams. And the last one that I wanted to talk about under this compliance umbrella is telephone services. Obviously, Teams has telephone services. It can be connected to your public switch telephone network, and the rules and the regulations for telephone compliance can vary widely from state to state or country to country. So it's really important to understand those telephone rules. When is it okay to record a telephone call? Do people have to be notified if you're recording a call? Is it one-party consent or two-party consent? That can, for a recording, that can vary state to state here within the United States, and I'm sure widely varies in different countries around the world as well. So, telephone is one of those areas where you may have to put a bit of work into making sure that your team's deployment is compliant and you're working with all the rules and regulations that apply to your organization in your locale. All right, next best practice we're going to move on to here is headsets. I find this incredibly important when doing any sort of Teams or VoIP solution with customers. The headset that you're giving to your users when they're doing any sort of VoIP, voice over internet protocol, can make a huge difference. I see organizations, buying cheap headsets and pushing them out en masse, and then, people are upset with the call quality. I can't hear, or the other person can't hear me. And, it comes back to just a cheap headset. It's really important to make sure that you have good headsets that everybody can use. If that's, a feature of Teams that you're going to be rolling out, pay attention to the headsets. You need to understand how your users will be using Teams. Personally, I'm on the phone all day, a lot of times through Teams. I have a pretty good headset here that I use. Should you have wired or wireless headsets? Again, wireless headsets probably a bit more expensive. They can be very good quality now, but wired headsets might give you better quality or be less expensive. All that has to go into consideration buying headsets for your people. Noise canceling headphones are always a good idea, especially in a loud environment. Or if a lot of people working from home now, it's easy that you could have somebody else in the house making noise. Noise canceling headsets can be very useful. And then, of course, you want to train your users on the headsets. Different headsets have different buttons and features and functionality. The one I've got on right now is a Plantronics Voyager UC. I don't know what the number is with it anymore, but it's a pretty decent headset. But it's got a bunch of buttons on the ears and a mute button on the mic boom. You want to make sure that your users understand how to use the headsets. It doesn't have to be super long or involved, but you want to make sure that users have some familiarity with how to use the headsets before you're asking them to join a bunch of Teams meetings using those headsets. You want everybody to be familiar with it. So really, headsets vitally important for your Teams deployment if you're using that voice features. Authentication and authorization. Obviously, with Office 365, any of the services, you have to log into that service. Teams is no different than Exchange or SharePoint in that. But it's important to understand that Teams isn't what's handling that authentication and authorization process. That's Azure Active Directory does that. You need to think about things like single sign-on, conditional access. Are people allowed to log into Teams from any computer that they want? Does it have to be an approved computer? Does it have to be, are there certain, does it need to have a specific virus scanner on it, or, all this? There's a lot of information that can go into the setup and control for this authentication and authorization. It's not really part of Teams. So you have to understand, the entire Office 365 stack and all the features and functionality there before you can start rolling that out. Modern authentication, understand what features are and are not going to work. As Microsoft moves away from that basic authentication, there may be integration with, on-premises Exchange mailboxes. There's a lot of people still using Exchange 2010. that we're seeing problems, as Microsoft turns off basic authentication with that hybrid connectivity. You have to think about that. Multi-factor authentication. How do you want your users to authenticate? You need to keep them secure. Pretty much all the compromised accounts that happen in Office 365 happen with accounts that don't have multi-factor authentication turned on. So you need to think about that. Some teams may need to be private. Whether teams are public, anybody can join and see the information that's in there or not. You need to think about who's allowed to be accessing specific teams. And some features may require higher license levels, things like multi-factor authentication, for instance. It may require different licensing levels or conditional access or Intune integration, all that. The licensing that you use can vary what features you get in that authentication and authorization sort of stack that really doesn't have anything to do with Teams itself, but can be vitally important to the success of your organization's Teams deployment. All right, next one here, clients. Of course, there are, hopefully you're aware, a number of different Teams clients that your end users and your admins may be using. The installed FAT client, installed on your Windows machine, and a client installed on the Mac. There is a web client for Teams. Make sure that your users are familiar with that. If you want them to be able to use that, make sure they understand the feature differences in each of these clients. And then, of course, you can have Teams installed on your phone as well. All these different clients work differently. The ability to join different teams or different organizations on these clients can vary. On my phone, I have Teams client that's authenticated, always logged into multiple different organizations, Office 365 tenants, whereas on my computer, if I want to switch between Office 365 tenants, I have to log out of one tenant and log back in with another. Users need to understand that. If they're using Teams from multiple organizations, understand the features that are in there. And of course, the big complaint I hear a lot with Teams client, and they talked a little bit about it in that last session, is CPU. Teams can use quite a lot of CPU, especially if you're doing things like virtual backgrounds, blurring your background, or new features where they're going to be adding avatars in there where you can put a little cartoon representation of yourself. That sort of stuff uses a lot of CPU. It's a big complaint that a lot of customers have, and you need to understand that before you start deploying these features out to your users. Is turning on these features really going to limit the user's ability to use their computer at all? You need to understand that, test it out, make sure that everybody's aware of what features and functionalities will work for them, won't work for them, and how all that's going to go, so that your help desk isn't overwhelmed with calls about, my computer's not behaving well since we put on Teams. That can really, again, derail a Teams project and really crash that user experience for your user base. Moving on to the next best practice, the network. Of course, Teams is a cloud service, and you're going to be pulling significant data through your network with a large Teams deployment. So it's important to take time and consider how that's going to affect your network, how it's going to affect your users, and how that'll all work for them. VoIP solutions, of course, really rely on good network service. A phone call, it can't stand much interruption in that network connectivity, whereas an email, you're going to get the email. If you get it 30 seconds late, probably doesn't make much of a difference. But if your phone call, if your voice call is real choppy, that may severely impact the usability of your Teams deployment. Wireless networks must be able to support team calls. Certainly I see customers, start rolling out Teams, customers on wireless, and then, after the fact, they find out that, a specific hotspot in one area of the building just doesn't have the ability to support the number of clients that are connecting to it. You really need to think about those wireless maps, connectivity for all your users. Quality of service is important for any sort of voice services. Your network team may be able to do things to improve that for you. You should work with them, make sure they're aware Teams is going out, how it's going to infect your network, how the user experience is going to be over time as you roll out Teams and enable those features. It's important to think about the network as you're deploying Teams. Next, team and channel creation. So when Microsoft deploys Teams and rolls out these features and makes this available, kind of their standard ethos or their standard model of operation is that they want to give all the control to the users so that users can do whatever they want and will use their products. But obviously organizations and IT departments may not necessarily be in line with that. You may or may not want your users to be creating new teams or creating new channels within teams or creating channels within specific teams. So you really need to think about what your organization's plan is going to be for team and channel creation before you start deploying Teams to users. Can anybody create a new team if they want? Can they mark their team as private or public? Who's allowed to invite people to Teams? How are channels created in specific teams? Should that be universal across the organization, or should there be specific teams that only specific people have the rights to create channels in? Naming standard for teams can also be something that you want to think about ahead of time. I've seen Teams deployments where people start creating teams that they're not necessarily aware that the name of the team is going to be available to everybody. And it can end up as a surprise when you get some interesting team names, let's say, that show up in the global address list or published to everybody and everybody can see. Can cause some issues there, so we want to think about that. You need to have a plan for how your teams are organized. Again, just think about, you have 5,000 people in your organization. If next Monday everybody's allowed to create teams, are you going to have a bunch of duplicate teams? How is that handled? Whose team is kept? Whose is removed? If that sort of thing happens. Make sure you have a plan for all this is really what's important. There's a lot of different ways you can go about all this Teams creation, but as long as you have a good plan and everybody in the organization understands what the plan is, things will go a lot more smoothly within your Teams deployment. What about Teams retention? Again, do you have compliance needs that teams are retained for specific amounts of time? Do you have compliance needs that say specific teams or data within teams needs to be removed after a specific amount of time? It's something that needs to be brought up, talked about. Legal or senior management may need to be involved in those decisions. Should teams auto-expire after a specific amount of time? And again, all this can really vary widely based on the industry that your organization is in, the organizational culture, and kind of your upper management decisions for how all this should work. So there isn't really a right or a wrong answer with any of this. It really just is about what works best for your organization. How is your organization going to be using Teams and supporting Teams? All right, moving on to the next one, moderation. Teams can be moderated. Specific, channels or chats can be moderated. So we need to think about, is a specific subset of our teams kind of a free-for-all? Again, what are our organizational policies and how does our organizational culture work? And do we need to control who can say what in what teams or chats, that sort of thing? Maybe you have a specific set of teams for company-wide management announcements that you probably don't want all the end users to post in there. Maybe you have specific teams that, you have a specific set of documents that should be loaded up in there. Who's allowed to load documents into a team? Who maintains those? Who's in control of that? This is really the sort of thing that organizations don't always think out very well. as they're deploying Teams. I think it's mostly because Teams, again, is a very different application than we're used to, so don't really know to ask these questions beforehand and can kind of get ourselves into a bit of difficulty if we don't have a plan for how we're going to do all this before we start rolling out Teams to the users. Consider limiting rights to post to large teams. And again, make sure everybody in the organization understands the expectations. You will resolve or avoid a lot of problems by having good policies in place and making sure that everybody's aware of those policies and everybody understands how this new technology is to be used within your organization. I find that all vitally important. All right, next best practice, naming conventions. Again, if you just let the users run wild, do as they will within Teams, even if there's nothing terribly offensive or, we're not necessarily worried about people naming Teams with inappropriate language, but how do I know, if I belong in the IT team or the information technology team or the IS team or the, naming conventions are important for finding the right teams, for finding the information that, is pertinent to a specific user's job role. So you want to make sure that your organization has a good naming standard. Somebody's making decisions about how these teams are going to be named and used and managed so that people can find the right information that they're looking for. Again, a lot of the issues that I see with customers, having problems with Teams deployment are easily solvable by doing a little bit of forethought. My users say they can't find, Teams is junk because they can't find what they're looking for. It's not really a Teams problem necessarily so much as a planning issue or the organization hasn't thought out how they're going to name teams, how they're going to name channels, what applications are going to be connected to Teams, how that's all going to work. If you really spend a bit of time before the Teams deployment and work through all these issues, you can save yourself a lot of headache on the back end. And of course, Teams names can impact email addresses and SharePoint sites, which will then be visible to wider audiences. Teams can have an email address associated with them that can be visible to the outside world, or you can send and receive messages from them. And if it's your organization, maybe you need to have more control over what those email addresses or SharePoint site names are for various reasons. So it can be terribly important to think about these beforehand. Save yourself some issues. All right, moving on to the next best practice. Who owns Teams data? This is kind of an issue that I see fairly often. Because it's the IT department is setting up, doing the deployment, making Teams available within the organization. Kind of the default is that team and that data is under the auspices of the IT department to manage and control, and that's not necessarily appropriate. Maybe you have a team set up for the HR department and they need to share specific documents that shouldn't be available to everyone else. So why is the IT department responsible for that data? It can be a compliance issue. In a financial organization, maybe specific documents need to be managed by specific people. Specific, job roles shouldn't be able to access specific documents, that sort of thing. So it's important to remember that just because this is an IT system, the IT department is rolling out Teams, the IT department doesn't necessarily own all that data in the Teams. And it's kind of surprising that this isn't something that people think about. Some teams are meant to last forever, some are not. Maybe Teams should expire, the data should be removed. Maybe that data should be kept forever. You really have to define that ahead of time. Who do you ask? Can I remove this team? This team has been here for X amount of time and it has data in it that maybe somebody thinks shouldn't be retained, but there has to be a process so that the important data is not lost, but then data that's important to be removed isn't retained longer than it should be. Again, compliance requirements are very important here, especially in keeping and maintaining that data. GDPR can have effects on that sort of thing. Really what it comes down to is understanding who's ultimately responsibility for managing the teams and the data in those teams. Those may be two separate groups of people in some organizations. Maybe the IT department is responsible for creating the teams and setting them up and making sure that they're organized in a way that everybody understands, but the data within those teams, that's not the IT department's responsibility. This is the sort of thing that we really, if we think about ahead of time, we can save ourselves a whole bunch of problems in our team's deployments. All right, a couple more of these, and then we'll open it up to questions. I can see we do have a couple of questions that come in. All right, controlling options such as memes, GIFs, and emoji. Maybe I'm a grumpy old guy here, but I'm not a big fan of these emojis and GIFs and memes and stuff being in corporate teams. But again, it's really up to your organization's kind of culture and management style. Should people be able to put their silly little Garfield Monday morning I need a lasagna sort of memes into Teams chat? Is that appropriate for your organization or not? Again, Microsoft tends to make these new features widely available without, while they announce them, a lot of customers don't feel like they're aware of when these features are coming out. So you need to understand how Microsoft kind of publishes the updates for Office 365 features so that somebody can be aware of when a new feature is coming into Teams and how that's going to affect your organization. And does your organization want to make that new feature widely available to everybody? Should everybody be able to, put whatever they want into Teams? So these fun features, Microsoft tends to turn them on by default. I'm generally not a huge fan of them. But again, it's not up to me. It's up to your organization, your organization's culture. So it's important to understand that how these features are controlled and rolled into Teams and turned on, and what your users are going to see and how it's going to affect the overall success of your Teams deployment. Again, I've said this a few times. I'll probably say it a few more. A bit of planning ahead of time can save you a whole lot of issues later. All right, so again, these are those 10 best practices that I touched on all pretty quickly. Training, compliance, headsets, authentication, clients, network, team and channel creation, moderation, naming convention, who owns Teams data, and the control of these kind of extra fun features. These are things that I think it's very important for us all to think about ahead of time as we deploy Teams. If we do that, our Teams deployments can be much better. So at this time, I'm going to move on to questions. I see I do have a few here that have come in. So let's see.
Yeah, I'll moderate those questions and feed them to you, Nathan. First of all, I'd like to remind the audience that we can answer questions until about 5 minutes to the top of the hour in order to give you a short break before the next presentation. So we have plenty of time, so please send them on in. Okay, let's go to the Q&A box. Okay, Nathan, let's talk headsets. There's a question and a comment about headsets. The comment comes from Eric. He's vouching for headsets. Not a question, but vouching for headsets. I went lower quality and had to quell a staff rebellion because of my choice. It only reinforced it does not pay to be frugal in IT theory. And along with that, we have a question from the audience asking, how do I find good headsets? Do you care to comment on that comment and that question, Nathan?
Yeah, so I've heard that story many times, and that's why that topic made it here into this. You're rolling out Teams to 5,000 users and spending $400 or $500 a piece on top end headsets can be really onerous, and it's probably something that most organizations, your upper management isn't going to feel real happy about shelling out for that. Maybe the high-end $400 or $500 headsets aren't really appropriate for everybody, but I think it's vitally important that before you allow or before you just sign off on upper management saying, okay, here's $15 basically Apple iPod plug-in headset sort of things that you're going to push out to everybody, and that'll be fine. They need to be tested, evaluated. Everybody needs to see how the quality of them works, and you need to understand how that's going to impact your users' ability to do their jobs. A good testing. Buy a few different headsets. Buy headsets that are, probably buy one or two that are probably over your budget, that are probably not going to be the ones that you're going to roll out to everybody. But make sure the evaluation team has a chance to play with them, to use them a bit, to really understand what the sound quality is, because that's vitally important. I just can't stress how much organizations have really great network, really great computers they roll out to everybody, and then if you put a cheap headset on there and expect people to use voice over IP solutions, that can really wreck it very quickly. And then everybody, the users aren't going to say my headset's crap. They're going to say Teams is crap, or the IT department is crap, or this technology is crap, and that can really hurt these deployments and user acceptance. So absolutely do good evaluation. I'm not really here to endorse any specific headset. There are definitely good ones out there, and there are bad ones out there. Good ones are expensive. Take time, make sure that you have a good group of people who are testing them. Make sure that you involve, budgetary decision makers in that, so that they have some sort of understanding of the decision that they're making. I've seen plenty of organizations where, the higher ups are making budgetary decisions without really understanding the difference between these headsets, that they personally would never use these crappy low-end headsets, but they expect the deployment to be successful, pushing them out to everybody. So it's vitally important. Spend a little money, make sure that you have a good group of testers, and get the headsets that work best for your organization.
Okay, great. Well, along that same theme, we had a couple of audience members pop in with the same suggestion at the same time. They both advocate headset advisors as a good place to start. Carrie says headset EPOS is always good stuff, which is what we lead with. And Jorge says headset advisors have good options for headsets. They offer headsets specific to Teams. All right, I think we've covered headsets.
Yeah, the Teams certified headsets can be important as well. Make sure that the headset works with Teams, that the mute button on your headset actually mutes Teams. Early on in Teams deployments, I had that issue. I had even a really good headset that's certified to work with Skype for Business. The mute button may not work the way that you expect it to within your Teams call, and that can be troublesome.
Okay, I'd like to remind the audience we have plenty of time for questions, so please send them on in and take advantage of this opportunity to have a one-on-one with a bona fide Teams expert. And moving to the Q&A box, the next question comes in from Dawn. She says, should we manage team plugins in our organization?
Absolutely. Of course, Teams is also, besides being, a chat platform and a meeting platform, it's to some extent extensible, and other applications can be added into Teams to provide functionality well beyond what Microsoft provides within Teams. So, of course, it's very important to understand the plugins that are going into Teams to make sure that you have a good review process, beyond just the IT department. Make sure that management understands the effects of adding in specific applications into Teams to making these connections to Teams. It could be, you can introduce all kinds of problems by just, not controlling what features and functionalities get turned on. So I think it's very important for us as the IT department, is kind of looked to as the experts in this technology across our organizations. We need to make sure that our client base, whether that be management or the end users sitting at their desk, understand the decisions that we're making, and why it's not appropriate to have your sales database software plugged into a team that's open to everybody, that everybody can see all that information, or why the financial records can't be kept in a way that makes everything available to everybody. You can have wide impact across the organization, both in kind of that cultural morale situation and within legal and compliance kind of situations as well. So yes, it's vitally important to understand what information is going into your Teams, either via users entering it or sharing documents, or applications that have connectors and plugins into Teams. Super important.
Okay, great. Okay, Nathan, the next question comes from Steve, if you want to follow along while I read these from the Q&A box. Steve asked, is there substantial auditing and reporting on team sharing and permissions?
Yes, no, maybe kind of. So again, kind of going back to what we started off talking about, that kind of admin training. Within Office 365, you have to understand that it's not necessarily Teams that is performing a specific function within Teams. It can be Azure Active Directory, for instance, which is kind of what I'm getting at with this auditing. If you want to know who's accessing Teams, that may be more of a Azure Active Directory situation than a Teams situation. So it's important to understand the whole Office 365 application stack as you're making these features and functionalities available to your users. There isn't, if you can go to the Teams Admin Center, you can look for a really long time. You're not going to find, who logged into Teams. It's just not a Teams function. That's Azure Active Directory. And then, if you look at adding that whole EMS stack in your Office 365, and you're getting cloud app security that's, maybe set up to alert you for big downloads, or, there's a lot of these different features and functionalities aren't specific to Teams. They're used from other applications within Office 365. So yes, Teams has auditing, or there is auditing for Teams, but it's not a Teams feature, really. That could live somewhere else across Office 365.
Okay, great. Next question comes from Robert. He works at a company with less than 25 employees, and he says, we've gone to an entirely remote model. Given with no control over our employees' home internet, would you recommend integrating public PBX with Teams?
So yeah, so of course you don't have control over your end user's home internet situation. You may not have control over the specific workstation, the computer, the laptop that people are using. So all this can have a really wide impact on your overall Teams deployment and success. So I would say I wouldn't make a recommendation on turning on specific Teams features based on where the users work or not, I guess. It's more of, if you're going to turn on that voice features, either direct PSTN calling, client-to-client calling, all these different voice features, it's important to understand what the impact of turning on those features or not is going to have for your end users, and then communicate that information to the end users. This is going to vary organization to organization. People aren't coming into the office. Of course, they're using their home internet. You need to make sure that you train them, make sure that they understand, hey, if you don't have XYZ level of bandwidth available, or if the computer that you're running it from doesn't have this processor or these specs, or maybe even this patch, that can be important too in the quality and usability of Teams. So I wouldn't necessarily say turn on this feature because you have home users, or don't turn on this feature because you have users, but I would recommend that you examine the features within Teams that your organization will be using, and make sure that the users are trained well on the requirements for those features. And if parts of those requirements need to be on the users themselves, you need to make the users aware of that. Maybe your organization isn't going to buy headsets again for everybody. You're just going to tell them, go get your own headsets. Spend some time training them. Tell them about the options. Make sure they understand what's important in a headset. Make sure you explain to them your experience. Going back to the connecting to a PBX kind of thing, make sure that users understand what the dialing rules are for their Teams client. Can Teams call out to a regular phone number? If you set it up right, it can. If you don't, then it can't. It can accept incoming calls. You can have a real PSTN number available to your Teams client, but you need to make sure that you have good training. Everybody understands this, and everybody understands what their personal responsibilities are to make these features work, I think would be the important thing there.
Okay. There's another question kind of continuing the remote work theme. Comes from Keitha. It says, we've been challenged with people using Teams working from home. We've tried using Ookla to benchmark minimum internet speed required. Any insights to how to better address this issue?
Yeah, that's really hard. People using Teams from home, and it's not just about, you can tell users that probably using Teams working from home over, a rural DSL isn't going to work great, but there could be other factors that are well beyond your control that have impact on that. How many people are working from home? Are the kids home, streaming Netflix all day? The various, virus and computer situations. People can have infections that an infected computer can hog up all kinds of bandwidth. So there isn't really a good answer, a good specific one answer to give here. There isn't, Teams doesn't take X amount of bandwidth. There isn't a good calculator that I can go to and say, if you have 30 meg down, then Teams is going to be fine or not. It can vary widely on a lot of different situations. So really what's important, again, is that admin training, first of all, start off. Make sure that your administrators understand all these different complexities that they're going to run into. Make sure that the help desk knows when somebody calls in and says, hey, I had to call you on my cell phone. Teams voice just doesn't work for me, or it cuts out after a couple of minutes every time. Make sure they understand, help desk understands where to look for issues here, how to explain those issues to end users, and how to make sure that the clients are really having the experience that they're looking for and the technology works the way that it's supposed to. Some of this isn't going to be within control of your organization. You have to understand that. Everybody has to make sure that we have a plan for how to deal with that. We need to train the help desk to support it, and then train the users for these situations. So if you kind of stick with good training, good understanding of the product, you'll probably be fine. But, that's why I stress that training and the testing and all that at the top of this presentation.
Okay, let's try to squeeze in one more quick question. And it reads, what team's naming convention should we use?
Yeah, that's a question I get a lot. I walk into a customer, I'm going to start doing a Teams deployment, and they say, hey, what's the best practice for a Teams naming convention? The answer is something that works for you. There is no specific answer to that. You just have to understand your organization's culture, how your organization works, and come up with something that everybody can get behind and agree on and understand. There is no right or wrong answer for this. Some organizations like to name, have a set of teams that are named for each department. Some organizations like to have teams that are named for specific projects, a combination of that, teams that are named for specific uses, sales document or sales training sort of stuff. Really, there's no good, easy, short answer for coming up with a good Teams naming convention. It really is up to your organization, is up to your organizational culture, working with your management and the people that are going to be actually using Teams, making sure that everybody gets something that they can agree with. And then once you come up with that naming convention, make sure that everybody understands what it is and why it is and how to kind of use Teams within the naming convention that you come up with. So training is really important here. Make sure everybody understands the choices that you make and why you make them. But there isn't a right or a wrong answer to how to build a naming convention.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions we have time for. Thanks again, Nathan, for a great presentation and answering all those questions.
Thank you very much.